Next month, the U.S. Navy will celebrate its 250th birthday, a reminder of the sacrifice and service that have shaped this country since the Revolution. In making that milestone, it's worth remembering that not all stories of military service are alike. Some are well documented, others nearly forgotten, and then there are the rare few that bring worlds together: war, sport, science, politics. Such is the story of Ted Williams and John Glenn. They were two American originals. One, the greatest hitter baseball has ever seen, the other, a small town kid from Ohio who would go on to touch the stars. And yet, in the middle of a war halfway around the world, Ted Williams and John Glenn found themselves flying side by side over North Korea, forming a bond that would last a lifetime. In his book, The Wingman, author Adam Lazarus takes us inside the remarkable friendship, equal parts unlikely and unshakable. He joins us now to talk about how it all came together. Adam, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Adam, I want to start at the beginning. How did this unlikely friendship start?
Well, it started in that John Glenn and Ted Williams were stationed at the same Marine Corps base in Korea together in the winter of 1953. Ted Williams tells the story that he was in the middle of a briefing, and this guy was giving a briefing to the small squadron. The squadron they were in is called VMF 311. That they were giving a briefing to this group of 20 or 30 pilots, and one of those guys giving the briefing was John Glenn, and Ted Williams looked across the room and saw him and was very impressed by him. And over time, Ted Williams decided he really wanted to be around this guy. He thought he could learn a lot about being a Marine Corps pilot, and they got paired together on a few flights. One of which was very harrowing, really resulted in Ted Williams doing something that nearly got John Glenn court-martialed. That's a story that's told in depth in the book. They were neighbors in their little huts where they were stationed together, and they flew missions together. And I think that's how they came to know each other. They really respected one another. John Glenn respected not just Ted Williams' baseball ability, but the fact that he was taking away from the middle of the prime of his baseball career to serve in combat for his country. And I think that's how the friendship began. And then it sort of ebbed and flowed over the years, but it picked up much more intensely later on in life, when they were both towards the end of their careers. Ted Williams had long since retired from baseball, but he was sort of housebound and living the retired life. And John Glenn was on his way out of his service in the United States Senate and was getting ready to go back to space again, actually, in 1998. But it's an interesting friendship that began when they were young men and sort of became stronger and stronger and sort of peaked when they were old senior citizens living the semi-retired life.
Yeah. Was this connection immediate, or did it take time over years? Because they could not have been different. One was a chart type congressman, the other this flowing baseball player. Opposites attract, or?
That's certainly one way I've looked at it. That's opposites attract. I think there were other things that certainly their service together, this sort of band of brothers idea that you hear about, old military buddies who serve together. There's kind of Glenn said years later, there's a bond that develops when you serve in combat with someone you can't even really explain. I think that's one of the chief reasons why their friendship developed and became strong. They also, for all their differences, I think they shared a lot in common, actually. They both were absolutely intense perfectionists, obsessed with being the best at whatever it was they were doing. I think they recognized that in one another. They also, especially after John Glenn became an international icon for going to space, orbiting the Earth 3 times in 1962, I think they both understood what it was like to be in the spotlight, being part of the public eye all the time. I think that opposites attract element was certainly there too. I don't think John Glenn ran across many people like Ted Williams, and similarly, I don't think Ted Williams ran into many people quite like John Glenn. And I think they both liked being, talking with, spending time with this guy who was so different and unique to what they were usually around. Ted Williams was, for the most part, always around ball players, and John Glenn was, for the most part, always around fellow Marine Corps servicemen or politicians, and neither one of them spent a lot of time with a guy quite like the other.
Yeah. Do you think those differences caused tension, or was it just a free-flowing conversation?
Their differences, certainly the fact that Ted Williams was a diehard, dyed-in-the-wool Republican, and John Glenn, while he wasn't the most liberal, left-wing leaning Democrat, he was a Democrat, and it's something they clearly disagreed on a lot of political issues. And even as I point out, it's an important chapter in the book. When John Glenn was running for president, he was running for the Democratic primary in 1984. People on his staff reached out to Ted Williams to ask for some kind of small endorsement, do a radio bit, or just give a quote that I'd love John Glenn to be the next president of the United States or something like that. Ted Williams wouldn't do it because he was a Republican and Glenn was running on the Democratic side. So that led to some heartbreak from John Glenn. He felt he would have wished that his old war buddy, who he'd known for 30 years, could support him in his presidential run, but he didn't. And I think that had some hard feelings, but they got over it. And in the years that followed, their relationship got even stronger. And as John Glenn said many years later, they had a lot of political discussions and debates, and they were very heated. But I think nothing came to blows or anything like that.
Yeah.
They had a lot of common ground, but when it came to politics, not so much.
After the Korean War, their paths diverged dramatically. Williams went back to baseball. Glenn went to politics and space and eventually the moon. How did they manage to sustain that bond across such different worlds?
They did not keep in touch that often in those mid years, sort of the 60s and 70s, when Williams returned to baseball and then eventually became a manager, and Glenn was busy with NASA and became a politician. They exchanged letters and Christmas cards and telegrams and things like that. I don't know how often they actually kept in touch, outside of the occasional superficial idea of, how are you doing?
Right.
But as I said, later on in life, they really reconnected. I think the way I've always looked at it is everybody has a friend, maybe it's from childhood or high school or college, who they don't, live in the same town as, they don't see very often. But if they get together for a reunion, or they just call the other one up for, their birthday on once a year or whatever it may be, it's just like old times. I have a friend kind of like that who I don't see very often, see maybe every 4 or 5 years. Don't talk to very often, but when we get on the phone, we talk for an hour and a half about all the old things from college and stories, and remember when that happened? Remember this story? So I think everybody can relate to that. That's sort of I think what happened with Glenn and Williams late in life. That when they were together, they told old stories about their flights and their missions. The mission that nearly got John Glenn court-martialed, or the mission where Ted Williams' plane basically crash landed. So I think that's the kind of way I look at it. People can relate to when people come back in your life 10, 20, 30 years later, how for sometimes there's just a magic between the two of them.
And how did you first get interested and learn about the topic?
It's interesting. I'm a big baseball history fan, a diehard baseball history fan since I was a kid. Used to visit Cooperstown every year. Knew all about Ted Williams. I'm not a Boston Red Sox fan or anything like that, but I knew all about Ted Williams and 406 and 521 home runs and everything he achieved. And conversely, I'm from the state of Ohio, and John Glenn was actually my senator from the time I was born to the time I was a sophomore in high school. And I even knew about his space career. My dad and I used to watch The Right Stuff together, and John Glenn is a big figure in The Right Stuff. And so I knew a lot about both these guys, and I had no idea about this connection. And one day, it was actually Veterans Day several years ago. There's a Twitter account that posts old photos of ball players, Mike Schmidt and Christy Mathewson, Lou Gehrig. And on Veterans Day, they decided to dedicate the account to ball players who served in the military. And they posted this photo of Ted Williams at this Marine Corps base sitting next to John Glenn. And there was a simple tagline, something like, "Did you know that during the Korean War, John Glenn and Ted Williams flew missions together?" And again, I knew a lot about both these men. I knew they both served in the Korean War, and I knew a lot about their background, and I had no idea about this. And I was just really interested to learn this new angle of both men's lives. And I did some more research on it and found there was a connection here. They served together, and was really intrigued. Wasn't sure quite yet if there was a book here or not. But the more and more I read biographies and profiles, magazine articles, I could tell that their relationship meant something to one another. And it kind of clinched for me was when was 77 years old in 1998. He went back to space for 36 years after the first time he went back to space. I remember that when it happened. It was a big deal that he was going back to space at the age of 77. And I heard these stories about one of the first people he invited to the launch was Ted Williams. And Ted Williams was very old. He was old, but he had in very poor health. He had 3 strokes, and he had fallen and broken his hip, and he was in a wheelchair. And but John Glenn invited him to be at the launch. And Ted Williams, even though it was very difficult for him, traveled across the state of Florida to be there. And as this story goes, that several people told me that when John Glenn's spaceship was launching up into the air, Ted Williams was sort of rising out of his wheelchair, cheering him on. And that kind of clinched it for me that this is a neat story here, that all those years later after their service in the Korean War, that we still had this connection and this bond. And that's when I started, outlining it as a book.
Your research draws from unpublished letters, diaries, military records. Was there one discovery that surprised you most and changed the way how you wrote the book?
I don't know if it changed the way I wrote the book, but able to interview son of the man who called Ted Williams up to service. Ted Williams was in the middle of his baseball career in 1951. He was 32 years old. He was, still the best hitter in baseball, especially since Joe DiMaggio was about to retire. And at the age of 32, when the Korean War is in full-fledged combat, the Marine Corps needed more pilots and more men with experience to serve. And Ted Williams had served as an instructor during World War II. And this one colonel in the Marine Corps was tasked with looking over candidates of reservists who could be recalled to come back and serve. And a file came across his desk, Williams, Theodore. He must not have been a big baseball fan. He didn't resonate with him that he was Williams Theodore was Ted Williams. And he processed the paperwork, said this guy fits the criteria. He's going to war. Inform him. The address on file was actually Fenway Park. That again didn't set off any bells with this colonel in the Marine Corps. But I thought it was a neat story of how it happened, how he got recalled sort of by accident. If he had known that this was actually Ted Williams, the ball player, he might not have sent the paperwork along. But I was able to do some research on him and interviewed his son, the man who this colonel in the Marine Corps was able to interview his son, got some documents from him. And the more and more I read, I was interested. And I just, in doing my research on John Glenn and his background and his childhood and his going to college, I discovered that man was actually John Glenn's fraternity brother and college football teammate.
Wow.
And it was just a neat little cross of paths many years earlier in their trajectories of their careers and their lives that I thought was fascinating, that no one had ever written about. And I did all the fact checking I could, and it turned out that the person who this colonel in the Marine Corps, his son, verified the story for me. And it was sort of how the book opens up, that they had this connection. So that wasn't sort of a monumental aha discovery, but it was a neat little twist of fate that I came across in one of those unpublished letters. Wasn't quite an unpublished diary. This colonel had left sort of a memoir for his son to read, and it was in there. So that was one of the neat elements. I think the letters Ted Williams wrote home and the letters John Glenn wrote home to his family, to each of their families, uncovered a lot of neat details about the missions they flew. So yeah, there were a lot of primary source documents that I was able to get my hands on that, weren't earth-shattering in terms of telling the story, but they provided a lot of really cool, neat details.
Did you get the sense that either man thought of this friendship as central to their life story, or was it mainly unspoken?
No, I wouldn't say that. Ted Williams was not John Glenn's best friend, and vice versa.
Yeah.
They didn't spend, as I've said, I think I say in the book, they didn't spend, weekends barbecuing together on the lawn with a white picket fence and their kids running around throwing the football or whatever. They didn't actually see that much of each other over time. They weren't, they didn't go on weekends and vacations with their wives together or anything like that. But I think they had a bond and a connection that was forged during their service in the war, especially that first mission, as I mentioned, that Ted Williams nearly got Glenn court-martialed. But also there was an event where Ted Williams' plane got hit and nearly crashed, and John Glenn was sort of the one who helped guide him back to base. And I think that sort of a baptism by fire for their friendship. But again, it was years later that you could see that their friendship really had meaning. When Ted Williams was sick and really dying towards the end of his life, he had to have open heart surgery that took 10 hours. He couldn't speak for months afterwards. John Glenn visited him in the hospital and would check on him. And there's this story that his son, Ted Williams' son, told that Williams had a tube down his throat for many months. He couldn't talk. And John Glenn would call, and he couldn't talk to Ted Williams because he couldn't talk. And one day the phone rang, and it was John Glenn, and his son came in and said, "Oh, that was John Glenn on the phone." And for the first time in 4 or 5 months, Ted Williams spoke, and he said, "How is he? How's he doing?"
Yeah.
And I think that was neat that he was sick and he was dying and he'd been, unable to speak for months. And the first words out of his mouth was he wanted to know how his friend John Glenn was.
Yeah.
So there was just a connection there. It was certainly unspoken. I don't think they talked about how much their friendship meant to one another, but I think there was a bond there, and they both, if nothing else, they had a deep-seated mutual respect for one another, and I think that's what really carried their friendship over the years.
When we look back at John Glenn and Ted Williams, we usually see them through separate lenses: baseball, space, politics. What does the story together tell us about America, heroism, and perhaps friendship itself?
Well, heroism is certainly the fact that both men served in 2 wars together. Ted Williams missed 5 years of his baseball career. It wasn't exactly voluntary. It wasn't like Pat Tillman leaving the NFL to go serve in Afghanistan. But he did his duty, and he didn't complain about it. He complained behind closed doors, but he did his duty. John Glenn was a gung-ho Marine and wanted to serve. He actually begged his superiors to send him to the Korean War because he was still stateside for the first couple of years of the war. So I think the fact that both men gave so much back to their country in that respect, and John Glenn gave back to his country 10 times over with his NASA work and his military test pilot work and his service as a United States Senator. But I think that's the thing to take away, the heroism of these 2 men, that they gave back to their country. The other thing, and this sort of ties both to their friendship, I think, as I said earlier, Ted Williams and John Glenn, completely different in almost every respect, and politically speaking. One was a diehard Republican. One was a 4-term member of the United States Senate as a Democrat. And while that got in the way of their relationship when Ted Williams wouldn't endorse John Glenn for president, it didn't ruin their relationship. It's hard. You'd be hard-pressed in today's climate to imagine a diehard Republican and a United States Senator serving as a Democrat to agree on anything. And these 2 agreed on their friendship, and they spent time together. They argued politics. It's not that they stayed away from politics every waking moment, but they had that mutual respect superseded any political affiliation. And I think that's kind of a lesson a lot of people today could learn. Just because you're on one side of the aisle ideologically or politically doesn't mean you have to shut out other people who have meant something to you in your life. And I think there's probably a lot of people out there on both sides of the aisle who could learn from that.
Yeah. Let's fast forward. Do you think their kind of bond, their friendship, could exist in today's world with social media and Twitter and X and other things like that, and in politics and media scrutiny?
God, I've thought about that many times during the course of writing and promoting this book. I would like to say yes. I would hope the answer is yes. I would be surprised if their friendship, let's just say their friendship would be deeply tested today.
Okay.
I just think that there is much more anger and hatred in partisan politics today than there was even 25, 30 years ago. Maybe I'm wrong. This is not a subject I'm an expert on. This is just my own observations from living in America for 40 some years. But I do think their friendship would be deeply tested today. And I would hope that the bond, especially that their bond was developed out of giving to America, serving their country in a war, that I would hope that that would be able to pat down any hurt feelings or caustic conversations the two of them had. But I really don't know. I can't speak for two men who are no longer alive, for one, let alone two men I've never met in a hypothetical situation. But I think that it would be deeply tested today.
Okay. Where can we get the book?
Well, you can go to my website, which is adamlazarusbooks.com. But I will say, and there's a link on there, there is a big sale on the book. I think 65% off right now on Amazon, the hardcover copy. So if your listeners go to Amazon and just type The Wingmen, you will see a very good deal available for it on there.
Okay. Final question. I know you're a baseball guy. Who are you watching to win the World Series?
Gosh, I would hate to think that when you spend the kind of money the Dodgers have spent on talent that they don't come away with a World Series victory. But the fact that they aren't even able to put away their own division right now would be a little troubling. But the October baseball is a completely different animal for the first 5 months of the year. But the Guardians to win whatever it is, 17 of 19 games.
Yeah, 13 and a half games back at the beginning of the month.
I'm actually from Ohio, so I've been watching the Guardians all year long, and I expected them to be sellers at the deadline, and they surprisingly weren't. And to their credit, they made the right decision. They're in first place now. I think it's hard to compete with a team that gets that hot that late in the year. But again, October baseball, so much different from everything else during the regular season. And I would not want to pick a winner for the World Series this year. But Guardians, with their pitching, the way their pitching's been the last month, they will be very difficult to defeat.
Okay, perfect. He's Adam Lazarus. The book is The Wingman. It's a reminder that history isn't just about what men accomplish, but also about the bonds they form along the way. As the Navy approaches its 250th birthday, it feels fitting to remember that service often brings together the most unlikely of friendships, and sometimes those friendships last a lifetime. Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.